Okay, good evening, everybody. So welcome to this final shiur in the series on R Moshe Cordovero's Devorah. And we are now on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is an appropriate time to get to here with this material. And I think tonight will be the most challenging material in the sense that it involves the most development of Kabbalistic themes. Although really, in a way, everything that we've been doing involves Kabbalistic themes, but that's part of the beauty of the book, that it presents this material in a sort of more accessible and certainly a very practicable way. So let's first review the third shiur, and to some extent all of the shiurim that we had up to now focused on the idea that we human beings should emulate the divine image, and that this divine image has the structure of the spheros, of the 10 spheros. And in particular, Ramak, based on passage in the Zohar, begins with the idea of a kind of non-judgmental mercy. And that we wanted to distinguish from the kind of mercy that we often talk about when it comes to this time of the year, which is a sort of clemency, shall we say, given that judgment is already operative. But in the case of the highest level, the level of the Sphira of Keser, which is the very first of the spheres, there are, according to the Zohar and developed by R Moshe Cordovero, 13 higher attributes of mercy, which are beyond judgment altogether. Their concern is not with judgment in any way, but solely with love and care for the other and for the good of the other. So the fundamental notion that we discussed in connection with these 13 higher attributes, which are articulated in a passage from the prophet Micha, is a sort of humility, the humility of service. And although this is not said here by Ramak, it's said elsewhere that the ani, the I or the ego, is here turned into ayin through rearrangement of the letters, ayin meaning nothing. This first sphere of Keser has no distinctive character of its own. It solely functions as a means for the revelation or expression of Ein Sof, of the infinite. So it is at one and the same time in some way other than Ein Sof, because it's an utterance or an expression, but it's also not other than Ein Sof, because it has to be an utterance of Ein Sof. And it itself is nothing but a sort of a screen, as it were, for this projection or utterance. So that represents a kind of humility that we too should emulate. Then we looked at how this carries through with respect to intellectual judgment, classification, shall we say. In the case of the next pair of spheres, Chachma, wisdom, and Bina, or discernment. And Chachma is understood Kabbalistically as paternal. So the way Ramak explains it here, and we're dealing with a kind of paternal care, the sort of care and concern that you would have for something that you yourself originated, something that you had produced yourself. While Bina is a maternal sort of love, which involves gestation, nourishing something, allowing it to develop, and so on. And that also involves a certain kind of love and the association in Ramak and in other Kabbalists is with the womb. Bina serves as therefore a sort of maternal gestational function, and it's the sort of maternal love that always gives a second chance, and therefore it's associated with the idea of sweetening. So even if there is a kind of judgment and so on that is appropriate, nevertheless there's a way to return to that maternal space for a sweetening of the judgment, for a kind of restoration, shall we say. Now, there are times when a kind of self-assertion, whoops, sorry, I moved ahead too fast there. A kind of self-assertion is necessary, right? So we said that ayin means nothingness, and that's the association with keter. But when self-assertion is appropriate, and it makes sense to talk about the I or the ani, then Ramak suggested that we should mirror the other's style of action. So if the other person acts in a way that is spontaneous, then you should act spontaneously towards them. On the other hand, if the person in question prefers to act in accordance with rules and sort of stricter patterns of behavior, then that's the way you should act towards them as well. And in general, your action should be for the sake of the other, both human and divine. So that, I think, is where we got up to. So if we think about the chart of the spheres, or the tree of the spheres, we have dealt with the top 5, right? Keser, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, and Gevurah. But now we're going to deal with the next set of spheres. So Keser, we talked about humility of service, the 13 higher attributes of Rachamim, which are purely non-judgmental. Chachma and Bina, we talked about the paternal and maternal functions, origination on the one hand and gestation on the other. And in all of these cases, we're talking about this for the purpose of emulating these activities, these patterns of activity. Then we talked about Chesed and Gevurah as the good and evil inclinations and as love and other directedness. So now we're going to talk about the 5 lower spheres. So after Chesed and Gevurah, we get Tiferes. Here really begins with Chesed and Gevurah already what are sometimes called the mitos, that is to say the spheres that involve emotion. Keser we couldn't classify at all, and Chachma and Bina you can see are sort of intellectual spheres, a kind of originative or intuitive wisdom on the one hand, and a more discursive or gestational developmental discernment on the other. Once we get to Chesed and Gevurah, we're already dealing with patterns of action that involve emotion. And those two are brought together, Chesed and Gevurah, in Tiferes. So Tiferes is a sort of a synthesis or a harmony of the 2 preceding spheres, Chesed and Gevurah, and it's on the middle line, and therefore it's connected, as it were, to Keser at the top. And we'll see that there's a middle line below it as well. Tiferes is usually translated as beauty or something like that. It also, in our context, it represents Rachamim in the sense of a kind of compassionate mercy, which is the combination of Chesed and Gevurah. So it's Chesed, which is a kind of spontaneity, which is restrained in this by Gevurah, and therefore directed towards a specific person and that person's needs. So that's the kind of Rachamim that we get with Tiferes. It's the balance or harmonization or synthesis of spontaneity on the one hand, of Chesed, and restraint or Devorah on the other. And of course, all of this always presupposes that we started with Kesed, that we started with this attitude of humility in the first place. So through Tiferes, Rachamim, compassion, flows to the remaining spheres. And what we're going to see is that they are very often described by Kabbalists, including by Ramak, using the sexual metaphor of the union of the male and the female. Now, what I want to focus on, though, is the dimension of the spheres, which is focused on communication. Another word for the spheres is ma'amaros, utterances. They are expressions, they're utterances. Like the 10, they correspond to the 10 utterances with which the world was created. And it seems to me, on my way of understanding this, that this is a fundamental notion, and that the sexual metaphor of male-female union can also be understood in a communicative way. So that's really going to be my emphasis. Now, there are many different ways to explain the sense in which Tiferes is the product, shall we say, of Chesed and Devorah. And I've used many terms, or even just now, talked about balance, harmony, synthesis. This could be explained in many different ways. So I think that we should pay very careful attention to the way in which Ramak understands this relationship here in this context. And that's what I want to do now. So again, as has been my practice in the preceding shiur, I'm not going to read out the text. I'll give you some passages from it. I'll explain what he's referring to, but I strongly recommend that you look at the text on your own. I'm going to bring out some specific emphases in it. So now I'm going to turn to Tiferes, and the really crucial notions here will be the idea of Torah, which is associated with Tiferes. And again, that's a long-standing association in Kabbalistic literature, and specifically the idea of Torat Emet, of the Torah of truth. Again, that is something that here is emphasized by Ramak, and it seems to me of great importance for our context. Okay, so here is a passage from Toma Devorah, and I want to explain what's going on here. So Ramak says, "Od yeh rogil b'yosen nosen b'nosen b'divrei Torah." One should also be accustomed, when engaging in arguments with respect to words of Torah, l'chavein el tikunei shechina, to intend the enhancements of the Shechina. Right. So the context is that you're learning Torah, you're arguing with other people, as one does, about Torah, and your intention should be to enhance the Shechina. And we've seen this expression used throughout, and I have used this translation deliberately, enhance for letakein, enhancement for tikkun, because of Ramak's idea that tikkun is not merely restoration or reparation. It's not just fixing a problem. It's not just restoring a situation to the way it was before. It is making things even better, so that a problem in a relationship from this point of view is an opportunity to enhance the relationship and to make it an even closer one. So I think that's what he is saying here as well. So one's intention should be, even when one is engaged in arguments about Torah, letakna, lekashta, el hatiferes, tahainu halacha el ha'emes. So it should be to enhance and to adorn the Shechina, the divine presence, el ha'emes, towards the truth, or towards Tiferes, which is to say, to bring the halacha towards the truth. V'zehu machlokas l'shem shamayim, and this is controversy for the sake of the heavens. And of course, I'm going to say more about that. That is a familiar phrase from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, controversy for the sake of heavens. But here he has something very specific in mind. Dahainu, namely, chesed ugvura, lavo ala tiferes. Right, so you have this tension between chesed and gevura, between excess or spontaneity on the one hand and restraint on the other hand. And the machlokes between them, the dispute between them, should be l'shem shamayim, which means what? Lavo ala tiferes, in order to arrive at tiferes shamayim, because that is the meaning of the word shamayim here, the heavens. Tiferes is shamayim in this sense. Lahaskim halacha imo, to make halacha agree with it. The kol machlokas sheyotzei min hashura hazos, and any controversy that departs from this line, one should separate from. One should not have anything to do with any other sort of argument. Because Tiferes does not want to seize what is external, right? It rather is meant to be a focusing of the intentions within this spherotic tree, not about anything that is external to the sphera. It's not about anything personal, and so on. Even if we're dealing with Divrei Torah, it's all internal to the spherotic structure. And if your intention is merely to argue for the sake of arguing, then the end will be Gehinnom, will be hell, chas v'shalom, right? So that is not l'shem shamayim, it's the opposite. There is no machlokas that does not harm Tiferes, except for this kind of controversy, the controversy of the Torah for the sake of the heavens. Shekol nesivaseh shalom, because all of its paths are peace. V'ahava b'sofa, and love is at the end. Ultimately, it's love. That's what the Torah is really about, peace and love. So let me explain this passage a bit further. All right, so first of all, it's important to understand Ramak's account, that one remember that the word Torah literally means teaching. There's a very long-standing translation tradition, which goes certainly all the way back to the Septuagint, to the Greek translation of translating Torah as law, as nomos. But Torah is really teaching, and that's what Ramak focuses on. We can understand the association between Torah as teaching and the sphere of Tiferes on a number of different levels. So first of all, with many of the spheres, there are associated biblical personalities. You could have male, you could have female, but for the sake of this context, we'll mention the patriarchs. So if Chesed is Avraham, and Gevura is Yitzchak, and that's the way it is often understood, that, right, and Yitzchak is Gevura because of the restraint that was required when he underwent the Akedah, when he was bound and so on, then it would follow that Tiferes, the product of the two, would be Yaakov. Now, Yaakov is known as the first of the patriarchs who all of his children follow his path. That's not the case with Abraham, who has very complicated relationship with Yishmael and so on, or with Yitzchak, who has to deal with Yaakov and Esav. But in Yaakov's case, although there's certainly no lack of drama and complication, nevertheless, the idea is that all of his children follow his path. In the Gemara, for that reason, it says, Yaakov Avinu lo meis, that Yaakov, our father, did not die because his approach lived on through his children after him. So the thought is that Torah is associated with Yaakov and therefore with Tiferes, because it's not just the thought or the practice of an individual. It is teachable and sustainable thought and practice. And the other association that Ramak is building on here is between Torah and truth. And remember that in a passage that we've talked about before, it says, Titein emes leYaakov, you gave you give truth to Jacob. And in the bracha that we make over the Torah, we refer to it as Torah's emes, the Torah of truth. So I think the idea is that a machlokas l'shem shamayim, a controversy for the sake of the heavens, is a controversy between these different patterns of action, chesed and gevurah, for the sake of tiferes, for the sake of truth, through which flows compassion and blessing. And truth is achievable. I think this is really fundamental to Ramak's view, not through a sort of dispassionate approach, not through the leaving passion aside, but rather through a love that is directed towards the other, a love that transcends the individual. And remember, at the end of that passage that we just read, he said that ultimately there's love, right? And I think he's alluding there to a well-known Gemara from Kiddushin, Taf Lamed Amud Beis. Amar Rabbi Chiur bar Abba said, Afil ha'ava b'no, even the father and the son, harav v'talmido, the teacher and his student, she'oskim b'Torah b'shar echad, who are occupied in Torah in the same gate, nasim oivim zeh, they become mutual enemies. Right? They're arguing. This is a machlokas that they're having. That's the way Torah is learned. Ve'einam zazim misham, but they don't move from that place ad shenasim ohavim zeh, until they become mutually loving. Shene'emar, as it says, and this is a somewhat obscure pasuk from Bamidbar, from the it says es vahev b'sufa, seems to be place names, right, which we don't know much about. Otherwise, vahev in sufa. So the Gemara says, or Rabbi Chiur bar Abba says, al tikrei b'sufa, don't read b'sufa, ela b'sofa, but in the end, right? So the idea is that there's vahev, there's ava, love at the end. So ultimately, even though there has to be machlokas sometimes, and you have to argue out the different positions, nevertheless, in the end, it's the nature of this sort of Torah enterprise that because both of the arguing individuals have love as their motivation, and both of them aim towards the truth, towards a truth that is objective and transcends the individual, and they're not doing this for the sake of their own pride or to prove themselves or anything like that, right? Because of that, ultimately, there is a tikkun of love. There's an enhancement of love that is possible by means of the controversy. It happened to me the other day that my son said something to me, and my first response was, that can't be right. And then he proved that he was right, and he was delighted because I accepted it. And he was so happy. He called his sister to tell her that he won an argument with me. But it's not as though I was in any way upset about that. On the contrary, I was extremely happy to be proven wrong. And it only gave me joy that he had succeeded in proving his point. I had nothing else at stake in that. So I think this is the kind of machlokas, l'shem shamayim, that we're talking about, where you're not in any way trying to prove your own ego or to develop your own pride or anything like that. But you're doing it out of love, both a love of each other and a love of the truth, the Torah truth, towards which you are both aiming. And under such circumstances, Torah can be, Torah that's associated with Tiferes is a kind of harmonizing of Chesed and Gevurah. That's the basic idea here. Let me pause there and see if anybody has any comments or questions. Yes, Mike.
Paul, just to make sure that I understand, the earlier parts of this chapter are all about pride.
Yes.
And you brought this in at the very end, but in a certain sense, because this passage comes very near the end of the chapter.
Yes.
It's as if this chapter, by emphasizing the loving relationship between those who are engaged in the study and God, that explains why what it means to oppose the pride that is the main theme in the earlier part. Is that the point?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
it's almost, I mean, if God weren't involved, there would still be this interpersonal love that comes out of the controversy,
Yes.
right? The machloket that that turns out to be the purpose. Is that the point?
Exactly.
That explains why all the emphasis and pride throughout the whole chapter.
Yes. Right. So this is a further development of the kind of humility that was already developed when talking about Kesser, but it's the specific development of that with respect to Torah study,
right?
And the idea that there's a humility that's involved when people are talking, even when they're arguing, with a view to getting the truth.
Right.
Yeah. David?
Yeah.
Sorry, David, I don't think we can hear you. No, sorry, I don't. Okay, I don't know what happened, but I'm afraid we're not able to hear. Okay. All right. Maybe he'll be able to.
You type it in the text, maybe we could read it that
Yeah,
way.
right.
No, I took my Bluetooth off.
Oh.
If I can ask a quick question.
Okay, sure. Yes.
So this concept of reconciliation, the only reason I have my Bluetooth on, which isn't working very well, is just so if the dog barks, forgive me, okay?
Yeah.
On the reconciliation, you have this, between Hesed and Devorah, and you have, and it's reconciled, as you say, through Tiferet.
Yes.
And it strikes me, and then you go down through the ages, and you get to Hegel, and in the world of philosophers, which you're a shining example of. Okay, the Hegelian thing of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Okay, which very proud of, but this concept was certainly brought up by the Kabbalists, but then it also is very much the equivalent of Rabbi Yishmael's 13th side, where he said, if you come across two opposing arguments in Torah, you should look for a third one in order to reconcile them. And I just wonder whether on the basis that I accept that Torah existed 2,000 years before everything else on an ongoing basis, and I just wonder whether you had anything about this concept of reconciliation, which seems to be very much a Jewish source rather than a foreign source.
Yeah, you're making two excellent connections there. So one, neither of which I have time, unfortunately, to go into in great detail, but so there are many people who connect the 13 midos, the hermeneutic rules of Rabbi Yishmael, with the 13 attributes of mercy. That's a whole other topic, but there is a connection, and that's a much discussed topic. And the second thing is that in his work Pardes Rimonim, in his sort of encyclopedic overview of Kabbalah, R Moshe Cordovero develops the idea of what we would call mediation, which is really just a translation of the Hebrew word that he uses, which then is fundamental to the Hegelian and other versions of dialectic. And he has a long discussion there of the way in which one sphere can mediate between two others. And Tiferes is exactly the sort of the prime example, if you like. So yes, I thank you for those connections. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Let's see, here we are. Yes. Okay, so what are the practical lessons that Ramak draws from this? He says, when you're teaching Torah to students, you should do it through humility and love, lowering yourself to the students in the way that Tiferes lowers itself to the next pair of spheres, which is Netzach and Hod. You shouldn't exalt yourself over the students. And then he has two other cases, right? Don't exalt yourself over the poor. So presumably he's writing from the context of a society in which scholars are considered very prestigious and the poor are not, and tells an important story from the Gemara in Tainus, which I'll get to in a second. And you shouldn't exalt yourself either over the poor or over the ignorant. And this is a really fascinating Gemara. So it happened one day that Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon from Migdal Geder, was coming from the house of his teacher. And he was in a great mood. He was riding along in a leisurely way on a donkey by the side of the river. And he was extremely joyful. And his head was swollen with pride because at his teacher's house he had learned a lot of Torah. And they came upon a very ugly person. And this ugly person said to him, peace be upon you, Rabbi. He didn't respond to him. He said to him, you're a worthless person. Look how ugly this guy is. Maybe all of the people who inhabit your city are just as ugly as you are. And then the man said, says, I don't know about that, but you should go to the artisan or the craftsman who made me and say, how ugly is this vessel that you made? Well, presumably it's obvious that this artisan or craftsman is no other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As soon as Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon realized on his own that he had made a mistake, he had sinned. Yerad min hachamor. He got down from the donkey, and he prostrated himself before this ugly man. He said, I've sinned against you, please forgive me. And the guy said, it's not up to me to forgive you. You need to go to the craftsman that made me and say, look how ugly is this vessel that you made. The story goes on, but nevertheless, the point has been made that even though you may feel very proud of yourself for your various achievements, that does not in any way entitle you to denigrate other people. And one should bear in mind that everybody, no matter how poor or how lacking in prestige they are, no matter what the measure of prestige is in your society, everybody is created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the divine image. So that's the practical lesson. Now, I also want to connect this to some later Mussar thoughts, in particular to the thought of Rav Dessler, Rabbi Eliyahu Eliezer Dessler, who was a very influential figure where I grew up in the north of England, where he spent a lot of time. And in his collection of writings, they were really writings that he sent to his students when he was away from them, and they were collected after his death by some of those students, and it's called Michtav Me'Eliyahu, a letter from Eliyahu. So he focuses on this idea of truth, the Torah of truth, the idea that there's a kind of objective standard that is extremely difficult for us to attain, although not impossible, because human bias is so deeply ingrained, it's very difficult to get rid of. And to illustrate this, Rav Dessler mentions the following Gemara from Ksubas. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi Haviragel, the tenant of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yossi, was accustomed to bring him Kol Mali Shabta every Erev Shabbos, every Friday, Kanta de Pere, a basket of fruit. And one time he brought him this basket of fruit a day early on Thursday. So Rabbi Shmuel said to him, "What's the difference this time?" Amale Dina Isli. He said, "I have a court case, and I thought I would bring it to you on the way to the master." Rabbi Shmuel did not accept it. But even though he didn't accept it, so there was no exchange of goods whatsoever, and even though it was a normal thing for him to bring, the only difference was that he brought it a day early. Nevertheless, Amarle, Rabbi Shmuel said to him, "V'silna lach l'dina, I'm now ineligible to judge your case." So Rav Dessler develops this story, and he says, look how far this bias goes. Rabbi Shmuel is aware that even though there was no exchange of goods, and even though it was from his own land, and even though it was a regular gift and so on, nevertheless, the mere fact that this guy was bringing him the basket of fruit a day early and had a court case in front of him was going to put some bias in his thinking. It was like taking a bribe. Right? So this is part of a whole essay of Rav Dessler's about what's wrong with bribery. And as I say, the ingrained bias of human thinking. At the same time, Rav Dessler says, I'm not saying that it's impossible for us to get beyond that bias. It's just very difficult. And he calls this attitude, the objective attitude, mabat ha'emes, the perspective of truth. And he insists that it's attainable. So how? Well, the basic line within the Musa movement that took Talmud Devorah, among other texts, as its foundation, is from Pirkei Avos, the first Perek Mishnah 6, where Yeshua ben Prachia says, "Aseh lecha Rav, make for yourself a teacher, and Kinei lecha chaver, acquire for yourself a friend." You need a view that is external to your own view of yourself. And you can do this through a teacher. You can also do it through friendship. But it's essential to find ways to get outside of your own thinking and to get advice from others. And within the Muslim movement, there are different ways of doing this, to have sort of an advisor or a mentor, and to have a group of friends. Sometimes that's institutionalized in the form of the Musa Vad, which is sort of a regular group of people that gets together to discuss their ideas. In the Nevada yeshiva system, they have a special idea which seems to have come from the Russian revolutionary movement called the Birja, where people are standing around, and they will sort of come over without any preparation and start asking you, what are your problems right now? What are you doing to fix them? And so on. It's a rather in-your-face approach. But there are gentler approaches. All of them involve using an external view in order to get beyond your own bias. So now I want to move on to the next three spheres. So below Tiferes, we have the pair of Netzach and Hod, and then we have Yesod. And I want to translate them, and Netzach as endurance, Hod splendor, and Yesod somewhat unusually, I'll explain why, but I want to translate as dissemination. So here's, again, a brief passage from Ramak. Hamizgoal Talmidim this is really from the end of the previous chapter, someone who exalts themselves above their students causes Tiferes to exalt itself and rise above Netzach and Hod, which are the Limudei Hashem, Talmidei HaTiferes. That's really the expression that I want to get out of it. Limudei Hashem is a phrase from a pasuk that we're going to talk about in a minute. And his gloss on that, the Kabbalistic gloss, is that they are the Talmidim of Tiferes. Okay, so we'll come back to that. That's what I really want from the passage. And someone who lowers himself and teaches in love, then Tiferes will also lower itself to its students, which are Netzach and Hod, and will influence them. Mashpia, influence in the sense of causing a flow towards them. Therefore, a person should be pleasant to their students. And should teach them in the way that is appropriate to them. And through the merit of such a teacher, Tiferes will also cause the flow to the Limudei Hashem, which are the spheres of Netzach and Hod, in accordance with the level that is appropriate to them. So what I want to get from that is the idea of Netzach and Hod as the Limudei Hashem. So that comes from a pasuk that may be very familiar as well. V'chol bonaich Limudei Hashem, v'rav shalom bonoich, and all your children will be learned of Hashem, and much peace to your children, from the prophet Isaiah. Now, the association with Netzach and Hod comes from the Zohar. So there, Limudei Hashem are said explicitly to be Netzach and Hod. And that is because the four-letter name of God, the Shem, Hashem, is associated with Tiferes, which unites its elements together, right? So the way that works is that the point of the Yud is Keser at the very top of the spherotic tree. The line of the Yud is Chachma, and then the first Hey of the name is Bina. Tiferes is the Vav that goes down, and it has to connect up with the second Hey, which is Malchus, which we'll get to, because the union of Tiferes and Malchus is really the goal here. But the Vav of Tiferes is what unifies the whole thing and makes it possible, makes the name operate. So that it follows that the Limudei Hashem are the Talmidim, the ones who learn directly from Tiferes, which is Netzach and Hod. And that passage in the Zohar says that when Netzach and Hod are cut off from Tiferes, then they're associated with lower forms of prophecy. But when they're connected to Tiferes, they are the means by which Torah is communicated. And Ramak mentions in particular the association of Tanakh, the written Torah, with Netzach, Mishnah, or the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, with Hod, and then Gemara, which brings the two together because it tries to bring proofs of Mishnaic statements from verses of Tanakh with the tikkun of both. So when Netzach and Hod are united through Tiferes, through Torah, and through the aspiration towards the truth, then we have a kind of tikkun, an enhancement of both the written and the oral Torah. Now, Yesod is also covered in this chapter. Yesod is usually translated as foundation, but I think it's important to see that it is associated with the power to disseminate, which is exemplified in two different ways. First of all, by the reproductive organ, and secondly, by the tongue. So it's the production, it's dissemination both in a literal sense and also dissemination of information or communication. And the famous pasuk that is associated with Yesod is Ka'avor Sufa Be'ein Rasha, but Tzaddik Yesod Olam. When the storm passes over, the wicked one is gone, nowhere to be found. But the Tzaddik, the righteous one, is you could translate it two different ways. Yesod Olam, a permanent foundation, or else the foundation Olam of the world. I mean, it's a whole question whether in biblical Hebrew, Olam means world in the sense that it does later on, or it just means something permanent or even eternal. But certainly the way the rabbis understand that pasuk and the way the Kabbalists understand that pasuk, it also means Yesod Olam, the foundation of the world. Now, this is associated in the Kabbalistic literature with the biblical personality of Joseph, who's known in the Midrash from very early as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous, primarily because of his sexual restraint with respect to Potiphar's wife. So that's the connection. It's his control over Yesod, over the disseminative power, which is important. And Ramak himself seems to deliberately connect both the reproductive organ and the tongue when he's discussing Yesod. And he cites Ecclesiastes, Koheles, the pasuk, Al titain espicha lachtias besarecha. Do not allow your mouth to cause your flesh to sin. So the idea is that licentious speech without any control can also lead to licentious behavior of a sexual kind as well. And I think it's important to note, although he doesn't say it explicitly, that this is the exact same quotation that is applied by the Gemara in Chagiga to Elisha ben Abuya, the most famous Apikoros, the most famous heretic in rabbinic literature, who is one of the four rabbis who attains the highest level of entering Pardes, but he leaves the path. And it's because of his own verbal expression. And then he also engages in sexual licentiousness as well. So I think it's not accidental that Ramak quotes that pasuk, which seems to connect the two disseminative organs, shall we say. Now, I'm going to move on because time is ticking away here and I don't want to keep everyone too long, to the final sphera, which is Malchus, kingdom. So Bina, we said earlier, is the maternal function of gestation. It's the Ima Ilah, the higher mother. Malchus, however, is the Ima Tata, the lower mother. And in terms of biblical personalities, it's associated with Rachel and Leah, and the union with the two aspects of the third patriarch, Yaakov and Yisrael. So the proper union, the elevation of Malchus, or Shekhinah, and its union with Tiferes is a real goal of the whole enterprise of Tikkun. It's, more generally speaking, through that union is achieved the union of the left or the female side of the spherotic tree, Bina, Gevurah, and Hod, with the right or the male side, Chochmah, Chesed, and Netzach, by means of the central line. Right? So Chesed, Tiferes, and then Malchus. And this is all rooted in the way the Kabbalists understand the pasuk in Bereshis that God created humankind, B'Tzalmo, in his image. And at the end of that pasuk, it says, Zachar nekeva bara osam. Male and female, he created them. So on some interpretations of the pasuk, that's just an additional fact. But the way the Kabbalists understand it, that is the divine image. The divine image consists in the polarity and potential union of the male and the female. Now, the way this is usually explained, I think, can be overly simplistic and can draw too heavily on male and female stereotypes. So it's often said that Malchus is receptive, Yesod is active, and so on. How to understand this? So I do not want to explain it in terms of a sort of sheer passivity of Malchus. I don't think that's not what the term means. Malchus means kingdom. So what does that have to do with receptivity? So my suggestion is that it's not passivity. Malchus, or kingdom, means a kind of active power that, however, is not self-dependent, but requires enabling by another. It's a kind of power that you can only exercise when you're recognized as having that power by someone else. Let me give an example. In the words of, among others, Reb Naftali Hertz Bachrach, in his great Kabbalistic work, Emek HaMelech, there's no king without a people. Right? So King Charles needs to be recognized by the people of the United Kingdom, otherwise he's not the king. Right? And if somebody else comes along and says, I'm the king, that is meaningless without the recognition. Conversely, there's also no kingdom without the king and the people recognizing each other. If the king is recognized by some group of people over whom the king does not claim any sovereignty, then that doesn't count either. There has to be a reciprocal recognition. That's what Malchus really means in the Kabbalistic imagination. Not passivity, but an active power that is dependent on recognition by another. So it's this reciprocal recognition that enables the king to exercise the powers of a sovereign, and that enables the citizens of the kingdom to exercise their civil powers as well. Right? The way the British Constitution works, if there were no king or queen, then they couldn't have parliaments, they couldn't have the court system, and so on. All of that is unified by the idea of the power of the monarchy. Right? It's the monarch in parliament who legislates, and it's the monarch in the courts that prosecutes. And if you're sent to prison, then you are at His Majesty's pleasure. You're being detained at His Majesty's pleasure. Without the proper recognitional relationships, that would be brute power, and it would not be authorized power. So the divine image, then, that Tselem Elokim is taken by the Kabbalists to consist in this polarity of male and female, as I said, of the right and left sides of the spherotic tree, which means that in our emulation of the divine image, we have to bring the male and the female aspects together as well. And that on different levels, within the spherotic realm, but also in the human realm, between individuals, but also, since the spherot structure each individual, it means the male and female aspects of each human individual as well. So this is the union which is achieved through the conjunction of Tiferes and Malchus. That is to say, given what we've said so far, between the love-based objectivity of Torah study and the reciprocal recognition that constitutes the community. Right? That's the union that brings about the, or that enacts, shall we say, the union of male and female in the sense that I'm using these terms, right? It's the conjunction of the love-based objectivity of Torah study and the reciprocal recognition that constitutes the community. Here's an amazing passage from the Zohar, which Ramak is concerned with. We'll have to stop soon, but there's so much to say about this passage. Pasuk Rabbi Shimon ve'Omar. Rabbi Shimon opened, saying, he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Beit El, and it says the masa of his journeys. Why does it say journeys in the plural? Right? You would expect it to say lemasa o, his journey. Why his journeys? Because there are two. One is his, and one is the journey of the Shekhinah. Right? Dahar kol baranosh, because every human being is required to manifest as, or to be recognized as both male and female. Begin in order to fortify the faith, and then Shekhinah will never separate from him. And then the Zohar goes on to say, you might say, if someone sets out on the road, so now this is all said from the point of view of a man, not surprisingly, given the historical period, right? If a man sets out on the road, he's leaving his wife at home. That's the assumption here. So then you're no longer male and female. So Shekhinah is going to separate from you. No. The Zohar says, Tochazi, come and see. Whoever sets out on the road should offer his prayer to the Blessed Holy One to draw upon himself the Shekhinah of the Lord before he leaves, while he's still male and female. So he says a special tefillah, a special prayer while he's still at home with his wife. And once he's done that, then he can leave, because the Shekhinah will go with him. In other words, even when he's away from his wife, he's going to be both male and female at the same time. Right? So then Yishtakach Dechar v'Nukva would be recognized as both male and female. Dechar v'Nukva b'masa, male and female in town, and Dechar v'Nukva b'chakla, and male and female in the countryside. So this is a fascinating Zohar. So I don't think this is talking only about an externalization into two different people, although that's one way to think about this. Because as I said, the spheres are also internal to each individual. So what we're talking about then as the final ideal with which Ramak closes the book, and the great aspiration of Tikkun, is a loving reciprocal recognition between these male and female aspects on multiple levels. So level number one is within the individual. So for example, between one's paternal and one's maternal aspects, or between one's chesed and one's gevurah, and so on. That's level one. Level two, between individuals in families, communities, societies, and so on. Level number three, between humans and Hashem. Level number four, within the spheres, because clearly Ramak, like other Kabbalists, believes that the way we act and the way that we enhance the spherotic structure within us also brings about a parallel enhancement of the spherot themselves. And then fifthly, between the spherot and Ein Sof, and the infinite divinity who's expressed by means of the spheres, so that the image of God is is also in a reciprocally recognitive relationship with Ein Sof itself. So now there's a lot to take in there, and not everybody is going to either say that they understand or accept levels 4 and 5. Nevertheless, even if you don't want to deal with those questions about what does it mean that there's an actual change in the spheros and so on, that still leaves levels 1, 2, and 3 as ideals, both psychological ideal, ethical ideal, spiritual ideal, right? Within the individual, between individuals, and between humans and Hashem. So the union of chesed and gevurah gives rise to this idea of Torah's emes, of a Torah of truth that transcends the individuals, but draws them together in rachamim, in compassion, in loving compassion. And this calls upon us to work towards a non-judgmental community that's based on love and on objectivity. Again, objectivity in the sense that we are engaged in a shared mission that aims at the truth. So to summarize, right, the ultimate aspiration, according to Ramak in Torah Devorah, has 2 parts, right? And I'm trying to put the first 5 spheres into part 1 and the last 5 spheres into part 2. So number 1, to draw the humility of service that is beyond judgment, that starts with the highest sphere of Keser, down through the spherotic tree, so that paternal Chochmah and maternal Bina, spontaneous Chesed and restrained Gevurah are harmonized through Tiferes. So that's the first part of the aspiration. And then second, through the influence of Tiferes, understood as a Torah of truth, to constitute a union with Malchus by building a community that is based on this love and non-judgmental rachamim, compassion. May we all find ways to realize this aspiration on Yom Kippur and throughout the coming year of 5783. And I'm going to pause there to see if people would like to talk further about this.
You have to unmute. You have to unmute. You need to unmute. Please unmute. Thank you.
All right. You spoke before about mediation, and having taught in the public school for over 60 years and experienced many conflicts, I wonder if Ramach's mediation that he speaks about can go beyond our small Jewish element and can be gone into the vast world.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. I think on the one hand, this book does occasionally, and not surprisingly, given its authorship and the time of its authorship, it sometimes seems to be addressing Jews only. But there are other indications that I mentioned in previous shiurim that it also has a message that is much broader and not exclusive to Jews. And of course, this has been an issue with Kabbalah in particular. To this day, it has a popular appeal among non-Jews as well. And every time, and it did have, even in Ramach's time in the 16th century as well, there were many Christians who became interested in Kabbalah. And then, usually there are some Kabbalists who are resistant to that, and they consider it to be inauthentic if it goes outside of the Jewish community. So there are some issues, I think, about the way in which it is taught. But nevertheless, I remain convinced, as you suggest, that it has a universal message.
Of mediation.
Yes.
Because there's such an important part of our universal world, of our public school system, and I think within yeshivas as well, where there's conflict and we need conflict mediation.
Yes, yes, I hear you. That's a great point.
Thank you, Paul, for these 4 exceptional shiurim. These shiurim are going to be online, so we'll put them together and people can share them with people that they know. And maybe we should review and then we'll come back for some more. But if people have other questions, they should stay on. But I just want to thank you for all your time and effort, certainly during a very, very difficult beginning of the year time period. And
thank you for giving me the opportunity.
So,
and thanks to everybody for
coming. No, but Paul also gave in between Mincha Marav on Rosh Hashanah. He gave us related to the Yud Gimel Midot Talmud Devorah, and it was fascinating. It was incredible.